Tonight, you are stepping into a quiet storm that started with a single image no one was supposed to see. A blue smudge from the Martian night, a whisper of something passing where nothing ordinary should. You'll hear why the silence that followed mattered more than the picture itself. Why scientists argued in the dark while the world kept refreshing. And how an object from between the stars forced humanity to look twice at its own reflection. Breathe slowly. Let the room dim. By the end, you won't know if the mystery is out there or right here, hiding in the way we choose to see.
Welcome. You are watching Whisper Science. Make sure to subscribe and join us for more amazing science content. Now, let's move back to the video.
It begins, not with an announcement, but with the absence of one. A gap, clean and cold where words should be. Telemetry was coming down, instruments were working. Schedules had been drawn up weeks in advance. Yet the official feeds that should have carried the night sky like a pulse instead slipped into a careful hush. That's how people knew something had happened, because nothing did, and it did so perfectly. The first ripples didn't arrive through conference halls or press briefings. They slid across dim screens at 2 in the morning, when the world is soft and the mind is unguarded. A few lines of text, a cropped picture, thin, stacked, faint. The claim was mundane and explosive at once, a signal from Mars of something passing the sky exactly when an interstellar object, catalogued and tracked and argued about, should have been there. Not green, not neutral, blue. A blue you felt more than saw, like the after-image of a lightning flash. For a moment, the image floated in that strange territory between fragile and undeniable, where reality is a question of how many times you blink. People who live in the spaces between official explanations recognized the pattern immediately. The quiet wasn't new. It was a posture adopted when the next sentence might commit you to a history larger than you can control. The picture didn't prove anything. It didn't need to. It only had to be possible. It only had to fit the outline of the moment, the way a key fits a lock you weren't sure was there until you felt the click in your hands. On message boards and midnight group chats, the conversation spread with the slow confidence of tidal water. The coordinates matched, someone wrote, timing within the window. Another voice, more careful, said, stacking can turn noise into stories. A third voice, not cautious at all, said, there are no coincidences left, only delays. The thread grew longer, then knotted, then frayed, but it never snapped. The idea, newly born and fully formed, was simple. Something from between the stars had skimmed the edge of Mars, and Mars had noticed. There is a way sleep documentary watchers breathe when they listen to a mystery unfold. Long exhales, even pacing, a willingness to let the narrative hold the weight for a while. They listened that way now, because the story didn't begin with a discovery. It began with a question about why the discovery had to be stolen from the dark. You can build tension from facts or from the spaces between them. Tonight, it came from both. Some said the color mattered. If the world had been primed for green, if chemistry and models and trusted instruments had all been whispering in one palette, then blue felt like disobedience. Others insisted color was a fragile thing, born of pipelines and assumptions and the stubbornness of cameras that were never built to read the night. But no matter which side you took, you had to admit the obvious. Reality was being negotiated in public, and the negotiation had the texture of friction. It was the kind that warms the air, the kind that carries the scent of something about to happen. Think of a desert night on Mars. The air is too thin to hold you, too honest to hide. Dust floats like memory. The sky is a sheet of old slate, scored with trajectories we pretend are straight because it helps us sleep. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a machine does exactly what it was told. Then a little bit more, because curiosity leaks from its seams in ways no specification can contain. It turns and it sees. The picture it takes is unremarkable by daylight standards, but we are not living by daylight right now. We are living by the fever of possibility. In another part of this story, the object's path is just math. It comes in on a line so close to the planetary plane, you can lay it on the map and forget to be surprised. It brushes past Venus like a stranger in a crowded market, misses Earth by a distance that is safe on paper and intimate in the gut, then drifts into a geometry that makes Mars the best listener available. Numbers explain this. They even predict it. But numbers are not the point when you are awake at an hour that blurs reason and intuition. At that hour, what matters is the cadence of the unknown gently tapping on the window and asking if you'd like to come outside. You could say that everything which followed was inevitable, in the way a storm is inevitable, once the temperature difference is large enough. Arguments formed, not because people are stubborn, but because reality leaves us no gentle way to change our minds. Some wanted the object to be ordinary in extraordinary clothing, a comet with strange habits and a taste for carbon dioxide, performing within the rules but at the edges of them, like a dancer whose limbs reach further than expected. Others wanted it to be something else entirely, something that turns every instrument into a mirror, asking the operator to describe not what is seen, but how seeing works at all. Silence held its position while the world argued. It didn't correct anyone, it didn't soothe. It only deepened, and in deepening it shaped the narrative. Official channels were not empty. They were preparing. They were calibrating. They were reviewing. They were doing the slow, necessary work of certainty. But in the era of instant breath, slow feels like withholding, and certainty feels like a luxury we're no longer willing to wait for. In the absence of an answer, the question became the show. You can hear it in the way people began to tell the tale to each other, simplifying without lying, embellishing without intending to. It became an urban legend of the digital sky. The night Mars saw blue, the night the object by many names betrayed a color it shouldn't know how to carry. In those retellings, we revealed a truth we rarely admit. We don't actually crave resolution. We crave momentum. We want the next frame and the next, each one just a shade clearer than the last, each one promising that if we keep watching, the picture will choose a side. Consider the gentle cruelty of being both right and early. If your eyes catch a faint line the first time it flickers into being, you own the burden of convincing a world that would rather not tilt its head. This is what happened to the first people who stacked those Martian frames and said, look. They were told to wait. They were told to show their work. They were told that if the universe wanted to be believed, it would have chosen a better camera. They accepted this because they were patient, and because patience is how you earn the right to say, I told you so, without ever saying it. Meanwhile, the object continued on, immune to our timelines, indifferent to our suspense. It doesn't know how long a press office needs. It doesn't care what we call it. It doesn't slow down for disbelief. In another life, you'd resent that. Tonight, you admire it. The lack of malice is a kind of mercy in a cosmos that owes us nothing. There is a particular sound auditory editor's love for moments like these. The hush of a late train passing somewhere you can see, a distant rumble that suggests direction without admitting destination. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now. A suggestion that the data to come will not settle the argument so much as relocate it, that the answers will prompt better questions, that the blue will either collapse into calibration or step forward and ask to be named. The voice in your ear is not trying to sell you certainty. It's asking you to notice how your breathing has slowed, how your shoulders have loosened, how the room has taken on the weight of a place where discovery is allowed to be quiet. This is not the moment for a proclamation. It's the moment for a careful promise that when official words arrive, they will not erase the memory of how the unofficial ones felt. Both will belong to the same story, because both are true in the way that matters. One tells you what the numbers say. The other tells you why the numbers were worth finding at all. Somewhere in the middle of this, a thought emerges, Shy at first, then bolder. Perhaps the color isn't the most important part. Perhaps what matters is that a surface instrument on a mute world might have glimpsed a traveler, and that the glimpse, however faint, was enough to shake the habit of assuming we've seen it all before. If that's the gift, take it. Accept that it arrived wrapped in controversy and handed from palm to palm in the dim corridors of the internet. Accept that it needed your imagination to live for a while. Most truths do. Now take one more breath. Let the blue fade, not into gray, but into a kind of patient curiosity. Ahead lies the shape of the encounter itself, the angles and distances, the days-long window where instruments turned and time stretched, the choreography that brought a visitor from deep space into alignment with red dust and human expectation. You've heard the whisper. Next, you'll feel the approach. And when you do, you may find that the hush wasn't empty at all. It was a container. It was the space required to carry something heavy without spilling it. The silence was the first admission that this might be bigger than a picture. It might be a mirror, angled just so, catching a reflection we weren't ready to see until we did. Hold that thought as we step forward. The story will rewind, not to erase the present, but to teach it how to stand. The sky above Mars will lighten by a fraction as the object threads the plane we built our lives on, and the numbers will begin to sing. You won't need to choose a side yet. You'll only need to watch. Soft hook to part 2. We go back now to the week the geometry clicked into place, to the quiet choreography of trajectories and the first plans to catch a visitor in the act. Because to understand a silence, you have to hear what it was meant to hold.
Welcome. You are watching Whisper Science. Make sure to subscribe and join us for more amazing science content. Now, let's move back to the video.
Rewind to the week before everything went quiet. The numbers looked clean then, so clean they almost glowed. In mission control rooms across 3 continents, screens pulsed with lines of ephemerides, coordinates plotted with obsessive precision. Every few hours, a new data packet arrived, another heartbeat, confirming that the interstellar object catalogued as 3I Atlas was still on course, still following the trajectory no one had expected to fit so perfectly through the solar system's crowded stage. It had crossed Venus's orbit weeks earlier, brushed the invisible envelope around Earth, and was now drawing an invisible thread toward Mars, like a needle guided by something unseen but deliberate. Outside those control rooms, the world had not yet noticed. The headlines were about budgets and storms, new discoveries elsewhere, not about a traveler falling toward a red horizon, but among the people who measure distance in astronomical units and seconds of arc, there was a hum building, a low tone of anticipation. The object's alignment with the ecliptic plane was almost unnerving. 5 degrees of inclination, retrograde, sliding along the same cosmic floor where our planets spin their centuries-old dance. Statistically rare, yes, but more than that, beautiful. Nature rarely paints with symmetry unless she wants us to look twice. The plan was simple in words, brutal in execution. Track the object simultaneously from space-based observatories, ground telescopes, and for the first time, a surface rover on another planet. Perseverance, sitting in Jezero crater beneath an ochre sky, would tilt its mast-mounted cameras after dusk and peer upward. The odds of catching anything were small. Mascam Z was built to stare at rocks, not the void. But curiosity is a contagion in science. Once the possibility was whispered, no one could resist. The calculations said the best window would last only minutes. Mars's thin air, still glowing from the day's heat, would scatter what little starlight remained. The rover would capture multiple short exposures rather than one long integration, the only way to avoid motion blur as both worlds moved in their separate orbits. The frames would later be stacked, aligned by hand or by patient code, to tease faint signals from the noise. That was the plan. Plans are stories we tell the universe in hope it will listen. When the moment came, there was no music, no countdown. A small line of code executed, and an ancient planet became an astronomer. The rover's mast turned, servos whirring against the Martian wind. For a few seconds, its instruments pointed through air that had never known the sound of thunder. Pixels filled with something almost nothing, randomness, dust, perhaps the glint of a passing particle of cosmic debris. Then the script ended, the camera reset, and the rover returned to its habitual survey of stones. No one on Earth saw it happen. The data packets would take hours to arrive. Yet across that gulf, a connection had already been made. Light from another sun, reflected off a stranger, captured by a machine made by hands that dreamed of connection. It would take days before anyone understood what had quietly occurred. In those days between capture and comprehension, the world kept moving. Communications from Mars followed their usual cadence: terrain maps, weather readings, atmospheric opacity reports. Engineers checked voltages, scientists logged observations, journalists waited for press releases. Nothing about the stream suggested that buried among gigabytes of dust and shadow was a sequence of frames that would, once aligned, reveal a smear of blue light. If you could personify data, you'd say it was smiling in secret. The first human eyes to sense something unusual didn't belong to a government scientist. They belonged to an astrophotographer working out of a small observatory built from recycled parts and relentless patience. His habit was to download public release images from multiple missions and process them for aesthetic composites, art from telemetry. Late one evening, he noticed a set of exposures tagged with timestamps matching the predicted flyby window. Curiosity, the mild kind that starts revolutions, nudged him to stack them. He aligned stars, corrected noise, adjusted the weight of each color channel, and waited as his computer rendered the combined image. When it finished, he leaned closer. There, near the coordinates printed in every paper about 3I Atlas, was a stain of blue that refused to vanish when he toggled the layers. It was faint enough to doubt, distinct enough to haunt. He didn't post it immediately. Doubt is the scientist's first language. For 24 hours he ran variations, wondering if misalignment, cosmic rays, or hot pixels could mimic a signal. Each iteration dimmed the noise but left the smudge. Finally, he decided that whatever it was, it deserved witnesses. He uploaded the composite to his small social feed, annotated it with the bare facts, and went to sleep. When he woke, the quiet world he'd known had multiplied into something else entirely. The post jumped platforms like static through wet air. Reposts multiplied. Captions grew bolder than the original. Within hours, a Harvard astrophysicist known for walking the border between orthodox and unorthodox science quoted the image, lending it credibility that no amount of pixels could. With his name attached, the story breached the walls of specialized forums and spilled into mainstream feeds. By the time agencies noticed, the conversation was already self-sustaining, a constellation of speculation burning across the networked night. Inside NASA, communication protocols are slow by design. Every statement passes through layers of verification, every image through calibration pipelines. The scientists there were still comparing notes, still checking raw files, still ensuring that what appeared to be blue wasn't T, an artifact of white balance algorithms tuned for Martian daylight. But outside, patience had evaporated. Screenshots circulated with circles drawn around the anomaly, arrows pointing toward destiny. Some called it a reflection, others an emissary. The distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that people felt, for the first time in years, that the cosmos had whispered back. It is easy to mock the frenzy from a distance, to label it premature excitement. But beneath the noise was something older than social media, an ache for meaning, sharpened by centuries of looking up and finding mostly silence. The idea that another world might have seen what we were too slow to notice carried a strange comfort. Mars, our future mirror, had become our witness. While arguments erupted online, observatories continued their patient work. Space-based instruments logged spectra showing a composition rich in carbon dioxide, faint traces of nickel, little water. Nothing about those numbers explained the color in the leaked image. Scientists repeated that color is a trick of context. A star's hue changes with atmosphere, a camera's response shifts with temperature. Yet even they kept the image open on a side monitor, watching its improbable blue as if it might blink. The astrophysicist who had shared it wrote a short essay the next day. In calm, clinical prose, he framed the anomaly not as proof of anything, but as invitation. A chance to ask why an object from interstellar space would display properties inconsistent with known cometary behavior. He cited data, reminded readers that skepticism is a virtue, and then with surgical precision asked whether we are prepared for the possibility that some travelers between stars might not be accidents. The essay ended without conclusion, only a question mark large enough to hold both wonder and discomfort. In the days that followed, institutions faced a choice: acknowledge or ignore. They chose the middle path: procedural silence. The reasoning was bureaucratic, but human. If the image proved spurious, haste would discredit the mission. If it proved real, words chosen too soon could shape history before the evidence was ready. Silence, in this calculus, was the least damaging form of honesty. Yet to the public, silence felt like evasion. And so interpretation filled the void, weaving science and suspicion into a single thread that glimmered even in doubt. Meanwhile, Mars kept turning. Dust devils traced slow spirals across Jezero crater. The rover continued its routines, unaware of the narratives orbiting its data. The object itself moved outward, its trajectory carrying it past the orbit of Mars toward the waiting gravitational hand of Jupiter. By the time official comment finally emerged, an understated acknowledgement that the frames in question were under review, the object was already days further along its path, beyond the range of speculation's reach. We were left chasing the ghost of a moment, trying to reconstruct meaning from the residual light. In retrospect, the blue image was less revelation than mirror. It reflected our hunger for contact, our impatience with uncertainty, our need to see agency where there might be only physics. But even cynics admit that certain coincidences feel designed to test our thresholds. The precise alignment, the timing with a partial government shutdown, the color that contradicted every other dataset, all of it felt scripted by a storyteller who understood how curiosity evolves into obsession. And somewhere, deep inside the networks that stitch the story together, algorithms learned what kinds of mysteries make us stay awake. The blue smudge became a pattern, a keyword, a metric. Even as scientists passed their data in measured tones, the culture had already decided that the universe had nudged us. The question now was simple, brutal, and unresolvable. What exactly had it tried to say? By the time the image had circled the globe twice, silence had hardened into something more deliberate. It no longer felt like delay, it felt like design. The agencies that once flooded the public with daily updates began releasing statements that read like weather reports, accurate, sterile, missing the storm. Journalists noticed first. Every inquiry returned the same response: data under internal review. No denial, no confirmation, just the echo of responsibility without the voice. Inside those offices, the truth was quieter but more complicated. Servers hummed beneath sterile fluorescent light, processing terabytes of raw telemetry. Scientists sat behind glass, surrounded by monitors where the same few frames of the Martian sky flickered endlessly. They weren't hiding anything. They were arguing about calibration, about atmospheric scattering, about the perils of seeing patterns in noise. Every frame held a possibility so fragile that naming it too early could break it. And so they waited, while outside, the world filled the silence with stories of its own. It's strange how quickly humans can turn emptiness into evidence. When a government shutdown cut non-essential communication budgets, the timing seemed too precise to ignore. Overnight, social media convinced itself that the silence was policy. Conspiracies wrote themselves. Maybe funding was frozen to prevent a leak. Maybe someone at Langley had decided the public wasn't ready. The truth was more ordinary. Bureaucracy is slow and timing cruel, but logic rarely wins against suspense. We are wired to prefer a plot over an explanation. In living rooms across time zones, people began to re-watch old documentaries about Oumuamua and Borisov, the two interstellar visitors that had preceded this one. They replayed Avi's interviews, listened again to his careful pauses, hoping to extract meaning from tone. Every word he had written before now seemed prophetic. The coincidence of a third interstellar object, aligned so perfectly with the planetary plane, felt less like randomness and more like a chapter arriving on schedule. Even those who mocked the idea privately checked the sky maps, tracing the path across digital orbits as if proximity could translate into participation. Meanwhile, astrophotography forums turned into makeshift observatories. Amateurs compared raw images, restacked datasets, and published their own color corrections. One version made the anomaly vanish. Another made it brighter. Each interpretation became a declaration of belief. The forums no longer debated physics. They debated faith. The faith that the universe leaves signatures and that ordinary citizens can read them if they look long enough. It was almost poetic. Billions of kilometers away, a machine stared into the night, and millions of kilometers here, humans did the same, hoping the alignment meant something. For the first time since the early space age, the conversation about discovery didn't belong to the institutions. It belonged to the sleepless, the enthusiasts, the skeptics, the late-night podcasters. Their voices blended into a kind of democratic astronomy, chaotic, passionate, profoundly human. They called it the quiet window, that stretch of weeks when nothing official was said, but everything unofficial bloomed. Podcasts speculated about reflective alloys, about hollow interiors, about signal modulations hidden in the noise. Hashtags trended, documentaries teased upcoming exposés. And through it all, the blue image floated like a relic, proof for believers, provocation for doubters. Inside NASA's digital vaults, however, curiosity had turned cautious. The leaked stack wasn't part of the official archive. Someone had mirrored public thumbnails before internal review. The raw frames remained locked behind authentication layers, waiting for clearance that required signatures from people who hadn't been to work since the shutdown began. Mission Control could see the data. The world could not. It was the most banal kind of secrecy, the kind built from forms, not fear. But to the outside, it felt like confirmation. Even within the agency, the atmosphere had changed. Engineers whispered about the ghost in Z-Cam, a nickname that spread through internal chat rooms with both humor and unease. One technician compared the hue to electrical interference. Another pointed out that interference doesn't stay fixed across aligned frames. A third asked the question no one wanted to put in writing. What if it's real? The room went silent, not because the idea was forbidden, but because it was heavy. There are thoughts that carry their own gravity. Once you let them loose, they orbit you forever. Across the ocean, in a lecture hall lined with chalkboards, Avi prepared another essay. He knew the rhythm by now. Observe, analyze, provoke. His students described him as calm, even playful. But there was a precision beneath that calm, a sense that each word had to balance on the knife edge between curiosity and credibility. He wrote about the color discrepancy, about the probability of geometric coincidence, about the long history of mistaking instrument errors for miracles. But midway through he added a sentence that froze even him. If this detection is genuine, it suggests that not every visitor between stars arrives uninvited. He stared at it for a long time before deciding not to delete it. By the time that essay appeared online, the leak had already evolved into myth. Reddit threads carried translations in half a dozen languages. Amateur astronomers built interactive 3D plots showing the object's trajectory weaving through the inner planets. Animations labeled simulation circulated as actual footage. The more official silence persisted, the faster imagination filled the void. People don't like mysteries half solved. They crave closure, even if they have to invent it. Still, within the scientific community, a deeper discomfort was growing. The data from JWST and Sphere-X painted a consistent picture. An object dominated by carbon dioxide, trailing an extended coma, rich in fine dust. Perfectly natural, yet if the leak was real, that same object had produced a blue reflection from a Martian vantage point, something no carbon dioxide coma should do. A mismatch like that can unravel entire frameworks. To admit it would require rewriting the model of what interstellar comets can be. And if you rewrite one rule, you invite the possibility that another will fall. Conservatism in science isn't fear, it's self-preservation. When the government finally reopened, the backlog of data review requests was staggering. The Mars team prioritized geological tasks first. Missions can't stop for mysteries. By the time the controversial frames reached calibration, weeks had passed. The timing had bled all momentum, and that perhaps was its own strategy. Interest fades faster than truth travels, but the world hadn't forgotten. The silence had already become part of the legend. In a sense, the shutdown was a narrative device the universe could not have scripted better. It imposed pause exactly where the story needed breath. Historians of the future might look back and see pattern, but from the inside it felt accidental. Chaos dressed as intention. Every delay, every missing press release, every cautious statement became fuel. Conspiracy is just curiosity without supervision. When official clarification finally came, it was elegantly hollow. The blue tint likely resulted from processing artifacts. The data showed nothing anomalous. A standard paragraph followed, acknowledging the excitement of citizen science while warning against premature interpretation. But even as the words rolled out, the analysts who wrote them weren't entirely certain. They had run simulations, yes, and many showed plausible error chains, but none reproduced the exact hue or shape of the smudge. They closed the report anyway. Science has deadlines too. Outside, the declaration changed nothing. The faithful kept the image pinned to their digital altars. The skeptics called it case closed. The silence that had begun as a gap had become a mirror, reflecting whatever each viewer already believed. For believers, denial was proof of depth. For doubters, it was the end of distraction. For the rest of us, it was just noise. The soft, constant hum of a civilization trying to explain the unexplainable before bedtime. Yet something subtle had shifted. Late at night, radio telescopes tuned to frequencies beyond human hearing, and for the first time, analysts found themselves triple-checking faint background patterns, not because they expected contact, but because expectation itself had changed. Once you admit the universe might surprise you, you start listening differently. In that quiet aftermath, one phrase began to echo through academic circles. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It wasn't new, but it felt newly alive, like a mantra recited against the dark. Maybe the image was a glitch, maybe it was dust, maybe it was something else. The point was never the conclusion. It was the act of looking, of daring to suspect that silence itself can be data. Even now, months later, if you stand beneath a clear night sky and whisper the coordinates of that encounter, you might feel it, the weight of an unsolved equation drifting through the void. The object is long gone, its tail a whisper of ionized dust swept into the solar wind, but its legacy lingers, suspended between pixels and imagination. And somewhere, in a server farm cooled by air that smells faintly of ozone, the original raw frames still rest untouched, waiting for a moment when curiosity outweighs caution again. Because every silence is temporary, every unanswered question keeps its echo. And when the next visitor crosses the threshold of our system, the first thing we'll remember won't be the data. It'll be the hush that came before. If light was the first and the realization that then chemistry was the voice that followed. The universe had once been the debates over color in a language we were too busy to what the object was made of. That's the comfort zone of science. Elements, spectra, signatures. Matter never lies, they say. It leaves trails, peaks, dips, wavelengths that act like fingerprints. So the telescopes looked again. They spread their sensors wide, from ultraviolet to infrared, to map every trace of what 3i Atlas carried through the vacuum. And that's when the second silence began. Not from the absence of data, but from the kind of data no one wanted to read out loud. At first, the numbers looked routine. Carbon dioxide, yes. Some water ice. Sodium lines faint but clear. Then the deeper spectra arrived, and something cracked in the calm. The metallic ratios were wrong. The nickel to iron balance was inverted. Nickel dominating where iron should have ruled. In the natural universe, that doesn't happen easily. Nickel forms alongside iron inside dying stars, in proportions that stay remarkably consistent across comets, asteroids, even planetary crusts. Nature doesn't improvise much when it comes to heavy metals. Yet here was an object from interstellar space that seemed to have rewritten the recipe. The anomaly might have passed as statistical noise, but there was more. Isotopic ratios, the subtle fingerprints of stellar origin, were skewed. The carbon isotopes leaned heavier, the oxygen lighter. It was like reading a dialect of matter from a place where physics rhymed, but didn't rhyme quite right. One researcher joked that it looked too clean, as if the sample had been purified by intention, rather than forged by chance. No one laughed long. Jokes are the body's way of testing fear in small doses. To the public, reports remained bland. Spectral irregularities consistent with volatile loss, we see the summary read. But in internal notes, language grew poetic. Compositional divergence, non-standard formation, potentially engineered structure. The words engineered and structure were never meant to sit together in a sentence about a comet. Yet there they were, side by side, like two strangers caught sharing the same shadow. Every instrument told the same half-truth. JWST recorded thermal behavior, inconsistent with surface dust. The way the object absorbed and re-emitted heat didn't match any known texture. Instead of warming evenly, it showed patchy zones of extreme contrast, some regions acting as if coated in a mirror, others swallowing light completely. That kind of thermal pattern usually points to complex layering, something stratified or perhaps composite. But that would mean the object wasn't a single lump of rock and ice. It was assembled. Engineers who spent lifetimes studying materials couldn't help but notice parallels. The reflectivity resembled aerogels used in spacecraft insulation, the emissivity similar to metallic foils designed to manage heat. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidence repeated enough becomes a pattern. And patterns are the universe's way of asking us if we're paying attention. Still, science resists drama. Every claim had to survive its trial by mathematics. Models were built, hundreds of them. Some simulated layered ices, others hypothesized crystalline CO2 under pressure. A few suggested exotic compounds formed in interstellar shocks. Most failed. The rest required assumptions so specific they bordered on fantasy. The only model that reproduced both the reflectivity and the thermal data was one in which the object possessed alternating layers of highly reflective and absorptive material. In other words, panels. It was such an uncomfortable conclusion that most teams quietly deleted those runs from their logs. In conference rooms, researchers spoke softly, using metaphors instead of nouns. If nature wanted to mimic design, one said, this is how she'd do it. Another replied, or if design wanted to hide inside nature. The room went still. Outside, the world spun on, unaware that in a few air-conditioned chambers, the line between astronomy and philosophy had begun to blur. By now, Atlas had already left Mars behind, coasting toward the outer system, its tail a faint ribbon of frozen light. Observatories struggled to keep up. Distance dimmed the signal, and every hour it faded a little more, like a voice drifting down a long hallway. But the data already collected kept speaking, and the more they listened, the less sense it made. A small team at Caltech noticed something peculiar in the rotational light curve, the pattern of brightness over time as the object spun. Instead of the smooth sine wave expected from a tumbling comet, it displayed sharp spikes, like the glint of sunlight on moving facets. That's how you spot metal in orbit, reflections with edges. Someone suggested the object might be flat, not spherical or cigar-shaped, but disc-like, thin enough to catch light unevenly. It was a dangerous suggestion. Flat objects don't survive long in space without purpose. Yet the data leaned that way. The argument spread like static. Every scientist wanted to disprove it, and none could. Models of natural fragmentation produced irregular shapes but not stable ones. A flat geometry that survived interstellar travel should have torn apart under rotational stress, unless it was designed to flex. One paper, quietly circulated but never published, ran finite element simulations showing that a structure made of layered composites could survive exactly such forces if it used phase-changing materials, matter that stiffens or softens with temperature. Materials we have. Materials we make. The implications were unspeakable, but they lingered like a taste you can't wash away. If the object was natural, then the universe was more inventive than we ever imagined. If it wasn't, then something somewhere had learned the same lessons we had about structure and survival, and left behind a piece of evidence disguised as a rock. When the first phase of data review ended, the official conclusion remained safe. No evidence of artificial origin, a phrase both definitive and hollow. Because evidence is never what we see. It's what we're willing to recognize. Behind closed doors, the same scientists who signed the report still stared at their graphs long after midnight, wondering why the object's heat map looked like architecture, why its light curve read like a rhythm, why its chemistry felt too intentional to dismiss. Even RV, ever cautious in print, couldn't resist the metaphor. Nature, he said in one interview, doesn't owe us simplicity. If this object seems crafted, it may be because the cosmos itself is a craftsman. To most, it sounded poetic. To others, it was a warning that the border between natural and artificial is only as firm as our imagination. Meanwhile, a new kind of listening had begun. Radio telescopes turned their dishes toward the object's projected path, sweeping frequencies just in case. They heard nothing, of course. Silence again, as expected. But this time the silence didn't reassure. It sounded like absence with intention, as if whatever made the object, if anything had, understood that the best camouflage isn't invisibility. It's normality. Weeks passed. News cycles moved on. The blue smear faded from headlines, replaced by fresher stories, more terrestrial dramas. But in certain circles, the anomaly lived on like an unsolved chord. Because once you've heard a dissonance that deep, you can't unhear it. Astronomers kept their instruments ready, checking the object's outbound trajectory one last time before it slipped beyond measurable range. And that's when another oddity surfaced, a slight unaccounted acceleration, tiny but real. The numbers echoed Oumuamua's mystery from years before. Non-gravitational motion, it shouldn't have been accelerating. There was no visible outgassing, no thermal thrust, yet the object was drifting faster than gravity alone allowed, as if propelled by something invisible. Radiation pressure, perhaps, or geometry so thin it caught sunlight like a sail. A solar sail, a word that turned the room cold. Mathematically, it made sense. A sufficiently thin structure could accelerate under starlight, no engines required. Natural? Possibly. Probable? Hardly. For a moment, everyone felt the chill of déjà vu, the same realization that had haunted astronomers with Oumuamua. Once again, the universe was acting as if it had read our engineering textbooks. In the end, the data tapered off. The object receded into darkness, unobserved, unmeasured, unclaimed. But its departure left a kind of gravitational echo in our minds. It taught us that sometimes the question isn't what we saw, but why we saw it the way we did. It forced us to confront the fragile boundary between accident and intention, between random chemistry and elegant design. And perhaps more than anything, it reminded us that discovery is never comfortable. It demands that we live in the tension between belief and doubt, between evidence and intuition. The blue smear, the metallic ratios, the acceleration, they may all have innocent explanations. But innocence, like silence, can be deceptive. Both can hide extraordinary things in plain sight. Next comes the hardest part of the story, the human reaction. Because once you plant a mystery in a civilization already hungry for meaning, it doesn't fade quietly. It grows, it divides people. It creates prophets and skeptics. And before long, the object itself becomes less important than what it awakens in us. When the object slipped beyond reach, most assumed the story would fade. Space doesn't keep witnesses, after all. It devours them in silence, scattering fragments across the dark. But some things refuse to dissolve so easily. 3's Atlas had already done something rare. It had imprinted itself not on the Martian sky, but on the human mind. The telescopes could let go, but people couldn't. The more distance grew, the more the story came home. It began subtly, almost politely. Scientists published follow-up analyses, quiet papers with cautious phrasing and equations that danced around confession. They spoke of unexpected reflectance, of anomalous heat diffusion, of non-gravitational trajectory variance. In academic language, those are small rebellions, the verbal equivalent of leaving a door unlocked in a locked building. The public didn't understand the math, but it understood tone. Something was being said between the lines, something that didn't fit neatly into nature's usual logic. Governments responded first with indifference, then with choreography. Committees met behind closed doors. Funding agencies reallocated small grants to anomaly assessment and signal verification. Nobody called it panic, but the urgency was there, a tremor running beneath the polished surface of diplomacy. The last time humanity had collectively stared upward with this much unease was during the Cold War, when the unknown carried the shape of missiles. Now it carried no shape at all, just a trajectory, a color, a whisper. On the internet, however, the story was alive in ways institutions could never manage. Forums evolved into cults of interpretation. Every graph was a prophecy, every data glitch a clue. A few tried to keep the conversation rational, building models, cross-referencing raw data archives, debating units and error margins. But reason was outnumbered. Mystery, once unleashed, doesn't obey scientific containment. It migrates into art, into belief, into the private architecture of longing. Podcasts with names like The Blue Visitor and Whispers of Mars topped charts in multiple languages. Videos stitched together telescope images with slow, ominous music, narrators whispering about a messenger in motion. One popular channel claimed the object's acceleration pattern matched Fibonacci ratios, divine symmetry hidden in the numbers. Another argued that the blue reflection wasn't visual at all, but informational, a transmission coded into wavelength. None of it was verifiable, but verification had ceased to matter. The story was no longer about what happened. It was about what it meant, and meaning is dangerous when mixed with fear. Across different corners of the world, new communities formed, some hopeful, others quietly unhinged. In Europe, a collective of amateur astronomers vowed to listen for returning objects using handmade radio dishes. In America, self-proclaimed analysts decoded telemetry leaks that didn't exist. In parts of Asia, poets wrote about the azure wound in the Martian sky, seeing it as a metaphor for human isolation. In Pakistan, in Cairo, in Warsaw, in Tokyo, anywhere the night sky could still be seen without glare, people pointed phones upward, trying to frame a mystery too vast for any lens. Inside NASA and ESA, the cultural shock manifested differently. Engineers who'd spent lifetimes chasing precision began to sound philosophical. Meetings grew quiet. Colleagues who once argued about decimals now sat in silence after presentations, staring at the same graphs as if they'd heard a ghost speak. It wasn't belief, it was the opposite. It was the realization that belief had entered the room, uninvited but undeniable. One veteran researcher described it best in an email later leaked online. "We used to think uncertainty was an error margin. Now it feels like a mirror." The effect spread through academia like static. Departments split between those who wanted to forget and those who wanted to look deeper. Conferences became more cautious, abstracts more cryptic. No one wanted to say the wrong thing, but no one wanted to stop talking either. Even the skeptics, who dismissed the blue reflection as a processing artifact, couldn't resist its poetry. Because beneath skepticism lies the same hunger that drives belief, the need to feel that our equations connect to something alive. Then came the art. Musicians wrote ambient albums using the object's trajectory as melody, turning orbital data into soundscapes. Filmmakers reimagined it as a parable, a lonely machine drifting through eternity, seeking the echo of its makers. Painters recreated the blue smear with brushstrokes that shimmered like electricity. Museums staged installations where visitors walked through dark rooms, pulsing with slow rhythmic light, meant to simulate the object's passing. It was as if humanity, denied official answers, decided to process the encounter the only way it knew how, through creation. But not all creations were gentle. As always, wonder attracted control. Fringe movements began claiming the event as validation of prophecy. The messenger from beyond, they called it, twisting scientific language into scripture. The blue glow became symbol and warning, a cosmic sign interpreted through lenses of religion, politics, even economics. Some claimed governments were hiding contact. Others said the silence was contact, that the object's design was a mirror forcing humanity to measure its own noise. The absurd and the profound danced together until neither could be told apart. Meanwhile, the data itself was still being passed, line by line, by people who refused to surrender to speculation. Among them were a few quietly rebellious scientists who formed an informal network, a coalition of listeners, as they called themselves. They weren't looking for aliens. They were looking for honesty. Their rule was simple: discuss evidence, not opinion. They met virtually, sharing recalibrated data, simulation scripts, and notes banned from formal papers. Every conversation ended with the same sentence: the numbers don't lie. They just don't agree. One night, one of them, a spectral analyst from Chile, posted something that froze the group chat. It was a noise plot taken from the last deep scan before 3i Atlas drifted beyond range. The curve showed a faint modulation pattern in the infrared, periodic, structured, unlike any natural signal known. It wasn't communication, at least not in any familiar sense. It looked more like heartbeat, slow, steady, mechanical. The group ran tests comparing the pattern against known instrumental artifacts. None matched. They agreed to keep it quiet until verification. But screenshots escaped. They always do. When that plot leaked, the internet erupted again. Theories multiplied like cells. Some said the pattern proved propulsion, solar sail oscillation. Others claimed it was encrypted data. The rational explanation was simple thermal pulsation, heat cycles from spinning reflective surfaces, but by then reason had no microphone. The world had already decided that something somewhere had pulsed back. In the months that followed, small things began to shift in the collective psyche. Enrollment in astronomy programs rose. Sales of home telescopes doubled. Streaming platforms released wave after wave of space documentaries, each trying to claim ownership of the mystery. Even political campaigns began referencing interstellar curiosity as a metaphor for transparency and exploration. The blue smear had become a brand, a myth polished by algorithms. But underneath the spectacle, something quieter was happening. Scientists started collaborating in ways they hadn't before. Rival institutions shared data. Independent researchers received grants usually reserved for government labs. Skeptics and believers, tired of arguing, began to work side by side. The object, whatever it was, had done what centuries of treaties failed to do. It united humanity, if only in confusion. And still, through all of it, Mars waited. The rover that had first glimpsed the anomaly continued its routines, recording dust, tracking winds, cataloging minerals. Yet its data logs carried the timestamp of that night, a quiet marker, a reminder written into its code. Machines don't dream, but sometimes humans program them to remember. Years from now, when new explorers scroll through that archive, they'll see it. That single sequence labeled with an asterisk. They won't find answers there, only coordinates. But maybe coordinates are enough. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't whether 3i Atlas was natural or artificial. What mattered was that, For the first time in a generation, the universe had made us listen without talking back. It had forced us to fill the void with meaning, with connection, with reflection. It made us notice how loud our species had become and how small. The debate still rages in quiet corners. Some believe the object was merely an interstellar shard, a relic of collision billions of years old. Others insist it was reconnaissance, a probe drifting between civilizations, measuring silence as data. The truth may live somewhere in between, where imagination and physics overlap. But whatever it was, it left us changed. It gave the cosmos a face again, one we can't quite see but can't stop searching for. And even now, as the object sails into the frozen dark beyond Jupiter, instruments still track its fading echo, each reading weaker than the last, like a heartbeat slowing to rest. Perhaps that's fitting. Maybe the universe needed to remind us that every story ends the same way, with silence. Not absence, not emptiness, just the kind of stillness that invites the next question. Soon the world would shift again, because, while humanity argued and dreamed, another instrument, one not on Earth, not even on Mars, would catch something else, a signal faint enough to ignore, structured enough to matter. It would appear briefly on a timeline buried in noise, and then vanish. But for those who noticed, it would change everything, because it wasn't from 3i Atlas. It came from the direction it had left behind. It began as nothing. A line on a screen, a whisper buried in static, the kind of anomaly that usually dies in the noise before anyone notices. But the world had changed since 3D Atlas. Humanity had learned to listen too closely, to lean toward the dark expecting it to breathe. So when the signal appeared faint and brief, someone noticed, and that small act of noticing turned a glitch into a revelation. The first detection came from a deep space array in Western Australia, part of the Breakthrough Listen initiative. The observatory had been sweeping the region of sky where 3i Atlas had last been tracked before slipping beyond Jupiter's orbit. Most of the time, the data was clean, cosmic background, pulsars, routine interstellar static. But on one Tuesday morning, amid billions of normal frequencies, there appeared a burst. Narrowband, repeating, structured. Not random, not natural. Something patterned. The team labeled it Event 1082. It lasted just under 2 minutes, centered near 8.4 gigahertz, right in the window used for deep space communications. That alone was suspicious. Too close to human transmissions, but there was no known satellite, no reflected Earth signal, no atmospheric bounce to explain it. It didn't repeat from the same direction in later scans. It just happened once, like a breath exhaled through the static and was gone. They almost dismissed it. They'd seen false positives before, aircraft, microwave ovens, even mobile phones interfering with the receivers. But one intern, bored and meticulous, cross-referenced the timing of Event 1082 with archived orbital data. The coordinates didn't point to where 3i Atlas was heading. They pointed to where it had been, a region of space several million kilometers behind its projected path. A wake, not a trajectory. That changed everything. Because if the object had left the signal behind, intentionally or not, it meant it interacted with its environment in a way no comet should. And if it hadn't, then something else had spoken from the same direction, something unrelated, or perhaps following. Within hours, the recording spread through the private channels of researchers who had been quietly obsessed with 3i Atlas since the beginning. They ran spectral analysis, searching for modulation, for meaning. The pattern was peculiar, not random enough for nature, not structured enough for language. The frequencies pulsed in ratios that matched neither binary nor Morse, but something in between. A repeating interval like a metronome skipping every fourth beat. Some called it interference, others called it rhythm. When the news leaked, officially or not, the world held its breath again. This time the headlines came preloaded with disbelief. False alarm, one outlet wrote. Another coincidence. The scientific establishment, burned by the frenzy months earlier, refused to engage. NASA declined comment. ESA issued a short statement, confirming no known spacecraft had transmitted at that frequency. And so the vacuum filled again. This time faster, louder, more desperate. Online forums exploded with theories. Some claimed the signal was an echo, energy reflected from the object's surface after interacting with solar radiation. Others insisted it was a beacon, proof that 3i Atlas wasn't gone but merely waiting. A few went darker, suggesting that it wasn't the object sending anything, but something answering from behind it. Each explanation drew followers, each post another layer on the mythology. Hashtags trended again, documentaries teased new evidence, and the collective heartbeat of curiosity returned to its manic rhythm. Yet, in quiet corners of observatories, something more unsettling was happening. The signal wasn't unique. Weeks after Event 1082, smaller bursts began appearing in datasets from unrelated instruments. Faint, irregular, always from the same rough region of space, always delayed as if bouncing off an invisible wall. They were easy to miss, but once you knew where to look, they were there. Faint flickers spaced in intervals of roughly 30 hours, consistent across detectors on opposite sides of the planet. To the untrained eye, it was just noise. To those who listened long enough, it began to sound like punctuation, pauses between thoughts. Not words yet, but cadence. Even the skeptics couldn't explain it away completely. Natural radio sources don't keep time that precisely. Pulsars do, but their signatures are steady and predictable. This was neither. It was improvisational, as if testing its own echo. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pattern vanished. Silence reclaimed the data. The last detectable burst was faint, distorted by solar interference, but it carried one final detail, a frequency drift perfectly aligned with the sun's relative motion. In other words, whatever had emitted it was moving with the solar system, not away from it. That realization fractured even the calmest minds, because if the object had continued outward, as every telescope confirmed, then what remained near the inner planets was something else. The press called it the echo zone. Scientists avoided naming it altogether, but whispers leaked from conference corridors of discussions about gravitational residues, magnetic interference, unknown plasma phenomena. None of the explanations fit perfectly, and that imperfection invited imagination to creep back in. One anonymous researcher told a journalist off record, "It's as if something stayed behind to listen." That phrase caught fire. Something stayed behind. It appeared on billboards, album covers, protest signs. People began organizing night vigils, facing the sky in coordinated silence, as though listening might bring the signal back. In one viral clip from Poland, hundreds of people gathered in an open field, holding their phones upward in the dark. When the footage was replayed later, audio engineers noticed a faint hum in the recording, ambient resonance at the same 8.4 gigahertz frequency. Coincidence, of course, but the internet doesn't run on coincidence, it runs on repetition. Governments reacted the way governments always do, with paperwork. International committees met to assess the implications of anomalous radio data. Security agencies classified segments of the raw transmissions, citing potential technological sensitivity. Some politicians demanded transparency, others demanded silence. The irony was cosmic. Humanity was arguing about whether to disclose a signal no one could decode. Inside research circles, fatigue set in. Every anomaly brought chaos, every silent speculation. Some scientists withdrew entirely, tired of seeing their work turned into religion. Others dove deeper, unable to resist the pull. Among them was the same spectral analyst from Chile, the one who'd first noticed the rhythmic pulse in the final scans of 3i Atlas. She had become obsessed. She cross-compared the new signals with the earlier noise pattern. Her findings were terrifyingly simple. They matched. Not perfectly, but enough to suggest continuity. It wasn't random. It was evolution. Her paper, published quietly in an open-access archive, went mostly unnoticed at first. But for those who read it, one sentence stood out. If the signal's origin shares a trajectory with 3i Atlas, then we are not observing a single object but a sequence. A sequence, the word echoed across discussion threads, through observatories, into classified briefings, because a sequence implies intent. It means there's an order, a plan, a before and after. Something was following something else, and then came the strangest twist of all. A reanalysis of old radar data from the same region, backdated to months before 3i Atlas's Mars encounter, showed faint returns of a small, compact body moving slightly behind it, almost shadowing its path. At the time, it was dismissed as debris. Now it looked like company, The realization hit slowly, like dawn through fog. Maybe 3I Atlas hadn't traveled alone. Maybe what humanity saw, the glowing object, the blue reflection, the mystery that sparked global wonder, was just the front wave of something larger, something subtler, something that doesn't announce itself all at once. A pair or a convoy, or perhaps something more abstract, in a process, a relay, a trail of instruments dropped through systems like breadcrumbs. Whatever it was gone now, or hiding. The signals ceased completely after the Earth's orbit crossed the region where the last burst had been detected. But to those who had watched, measured, and listened, the silence felt deliberate again. Too precise, too theatrical. The timing matched the anniversary of the original leak from Mars, as if marking a cycle. A reminder that silence itself can be communication. In the months that followed, the world returned to its routines. Markets rose, politics shifted, storms came and went. But beneath it all, there was a quiet sense that something had changed permanently. Not in the stars, but in us. Once you realize the universe can blink back, you never see darkness the same way again. And somewhere, in an unlit laboratory on the edge of the Atacama Desert, that same Chilean researcher replayed the final transmission over and over. The data sounded like static to most ears, but she'd spent too long in its patterns to be fooled. Every interval carried rhythm, every pulse held measure. And then she noticed something she hadn't before. A subtle delay at the end, a pause too deliberate to be random. 3 beats, silence, 2 beats, silence, 1. She didn't write it down. She just sat there listening, realizing that perhaps she wasn't the one doing the observing anymore. The cosmos had always spoken in silence, but now, for the first time, it felt like it was waiting for a reply. In the months after the final signal, a strange quietness spread across the scientific world. Not the kind that follows exhaustion, but the kind that comes after something impossible has happened, and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Every lab, every observatory, every listening post across the planet carried the same invisible residue, a hush too heavy to name. People kept working, but the rhythm was different. Conversations were slower. Questions ended halfway. It was as though the entire species had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The signal, whatever it was, had stopped. The recordings were archived, compressed, analyzed, reanalyzed, dismissed, and rediscovered in endless loops. Yet no one could explain why it existed in the first place. The frequency bands didn't match any known natural source. The intervals weren't harmonic, and the repetition wasn't random. It was structured, but structured like thought, inconsistent yet purposeful. Every pattern hinted at intention, but every equation failed to capture it. That was the paradox. Too human to be natural. Too alien to be human. A few months later, an international summit was quietly arranged, not in New York or Geneva, but in Reykjavik, where the northern skies remind people how small they are. Scientists, linguists, military advisors, philosophers, all summoned under the same rule. No recording devices, no press. The official reason was to review extraterrestrial data protocols. The real reason was simpler. To ask the oldest question in the world, what if we are not alone? And what if we were never meant to find out this way? The discussions began scientifically enough. What are the odds that random interference could produce the observed pattern? Could cosmic ray hits simulate rhythm? Could Earth's own technologies have echoed against planetary plasma? The equations filled whiteboards like rain, but by the second day, equations gave way to speculation. Someone asked whether the signal could have been a test, a calibration pulse, checking if anyone on Earth was listening closely enough to hear. The silence that followed that question lasted longer than any equation could fill. On the third night, one of the attendees, a quiet astrophysicist from Kyoto, showed a slide that shifted the room's atmosphere completely. It wasn't about the signal itself, but about its timing. She had mapped the exact moment of event 1082, the burst that started it all, against Earth's rotational position, Mars's orbital line, and the residual trajectory of 3I Atlas. When plotted on a single frame, the alignment formed a nearly perfect triangle, not geometric perfection, but precise enough to defy accident. 3 vertices, one near Mars, one near the signal's source region, one pointing directly toward Earth's orbital plane. She didn't say the word intentional. She didn't have to. The shape said it for her. After that, no one slept. The conference that had begun as analysis turned into philosophy. If the alignment was coincidence, it was an exquisite one. If it wasn't, then someone or something had mapped our position with extraordinary precision, not just where we were, but when. The thought that maybe the universe was aware of our exact location at that moment and had chosen to mark it unsettled even the calmest minds. Meanwhile, outside that quiet Icelandic hall, the rest of the world continued spinning its own stories. Religions absorbed the event with predictable grace and chaos. Some saw it as divine acknowledgement, proof that creation was ongoing. Others condemned it as interference, a deception dressed in science. In cathedrals, sermons blended scripture with data. In mosques, scholars debated whether listening to the void might one day qualify as prayer. Every worldview adjusted its mirror to fit the reflection, because nothing stays untouched by a mystery that big. In the secular world, it was language that began to shift first. People stopped saying the signal. They called it the reply. The word carried weight, as though humanity had already asked a question without realizing it, and now the cosmos had simply answered. Even skeptics started using it, not out of belief but convenience. It was easier than saying that thing we still can't explain. And so, the reply became part of everyday speech, a symbol, a shorthand for anything that transcended explanation. Governments did what they always do when faced with the unknown. They built committees. The United Nations formed a new department under its Office for Outer Space Affairs, the Division for Extraterrestrial Communication Studies. The name sounded bureaucratic, but its mission was radical: to establish what humanity should do if the signal ever returned. The first meetings were almost comical. How do you reply to something you don't understand? What language do you use? Math? Music? Light? Silence? The discussions dragged on, caught between ambition and fear. Some scientists proposed sending a controlled transmission back toward the coordinates where the signal had originated. A simple pulse, a mirror to the rhythm. But the proposal met resistance. The world remembered what curiosity had cost in legends. For every voice that said, "We must answer," another whispered, "We don't know who's listening." The universe was vast, but not necessarily kind. Maybe silence this time was wisdom. Meanwhile, independent researchers worked in the shadows. Their small team from Chile, Japan, and Canada, some of whom had been involved in decoding the original bursts, formed an encrypted network they called the Resonance Project. Their idea was to run pattern analysis not just on the new signal, but on historical cosmic data, radio archives going back decades. If the reply was real, perhaps it wasn't new. Perhaps it had been happening all along, hidden beneath our noise. Their software combed through petabytes of raw recordings, searching for the same rhythmic intervals. 3, 2, 1, pause. For weeks, nothing emerged. Then late one night it did. Buried in a 1996 dataset from an old Arecibo sky survey, they found a faint recurrence, not identical, but hauntingly similar. 3 pulses, 2, 1 separated by irregular pauses. The discovery shattered any illusion that event 1082 had been unique. The pattern had existed long before 3I Atlas ever entered the solar system. Whatever had spoken wasn't new to this neighborhood. It had been here waiting, repeating the same quiet syllables across decades, unnoticed, because no one had been listening for that particular rhythm. When that finding reached the summit organizers, panic spread quietly, disguised as curiosity. If the pattern predated the object, then 3I Atlas wasn't the messenger, it was the catalyst. The reply hadn't followed it. It had awakened because of it, which meant something out there recognized the object, as if it were part of a system, a returning signal, or a relic built to trigger a response once it met certain conditions. A key meeting its lock. For the first time since the beginning, scientists began whispering a possibility that no one wanted recorded. What if 3I Atlas wasn't visiting us? What if it was coming home? That idea changed the tone of every conversation afterward. Suddenly, the Interstellar wasn't distant anymore. It was intimate. The object wasn't an intruder, but a returning echo, a message to something already here. And that raised a far deeper question. If it was returning home, then where exactly was home? The next few months blurred into quiet obsession. The Resonance Project expanded its data mining to include planetary radar archives, solar observatory logs, even Earth's own ionospheric readings. The same intervals, our faint, elusive, kept showing up like fingerprints smudged across history, sometimes spaced by years, sometimes centuries. The earliest candidate was found in a 1962 military recording, a classified frequency test that had registered unexplained interference. It wasn't identical, but close enough to suggest continuity. That meant whatever was producing these echoes wasn't transient. It was patient. By then, only a handful of people still believed coincidence could stretch this far. The idea of a persistent, intelligent signature embedded in cosmic noise stopped being science fiction and started becoming the quiet background hum of scientific dread. No one wanted to announce discovery. Not yet, not ever. Because discovery would mean acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would demand a response. But the universe doesn't wait for consensus. One evening during a calibration run at a deep space dish in South Africa, a low-level technician noticed something unusual. The receiver, idle and pointed toward the region once occupied by 3I Atlas, was picking up random bursts of background noise, normal cosmic microwave radiation. But when she filtered the data by frequency, the noise wasn't random anymore. It pulsed. 3, 2, 1, then silence again, then again. Not strong enough to record officially, but unmistakable once you knew what to hear. She didn't report it through official channels. She just wrote a note in the station's logbook, one sentence barely legible beneath the timestamp. It's back, but it's quieter this time. Maybe it's waiting for us to answer. The note was archived unread for months, but eventually someone found it. And by then the world had already started to change in quieter ways. Language softening, research funding shifting, eyes turning skyward again. The mystery had matured into something subtler than fear. It had become a philosophy, an awareness that maybe the universe wasn't silent after all, just selective in what it says and when. And somewhere, in the vastness between stars, something continued to listen. It was strange how easily the world adapted to the idea that the universe might be listening. A year ago, even the mention of such a possibility would have drawn smirks, headlines, hashtags, debates about sanity and funding. But now, after so many silences, after so many small coincidences that no longer felt accidental, people stopped asking if it was real. They began asking what it wanted, or worse, what it already knew. The rediscovery of the pattern changed everything. The 321 pulse became a global obsession again, but this time the tone was different. No hysteria, no wild speculation, just quiet attention, as if the planet had collectively lowered its voice. The old noise of conspiracy was replaced by curiosity. Even the news networks began speaking slower, their anchors choosing words as if someone unseen might be listening for tone, not meaning. In classrooms, teachers used the signal as metaphor for patience, for observation, for humility. Children drew it on notebooks, 3 dots, 2, 1, a gap. It became the shape of a question mark redesigned for the stars. Everywhere, people started to wonder if maybe the entire universe was built to echo. And we were only now hearing our reflection bounce back. Governments, unable to hide behind denial anymore, shifted quietly into preparation. Not for war, there was no enemy one, but for response. What do you do when silence stops being absence and starts being dialogue? The newly formed Division for Extraterrestrial Communication began holding closed sessions with linguists, cognitive scientists, even poets. Because if language was to be our reply, it couldn't be purely mathematical. It had to sound alive. It had to mean something beyond numbers. The world's radio telescopes synchronized under a shared protocol, forming what they called the listening grid, a network designed to capture faint, non-repeating signals across hemispheres. It was humanity's first collective ear. Dishes in Chile, South Africa, Hawaii, Japan, and Australia shared a single clock, a single rhythm. Every day at the same universal time, they pointed toward the region where the pulse had last been heard. They listened in silence, recording gigabytes of data, most of it blank. Yet somehow, that blankness felt sacred, as if the act of listening was already part of the conversation. And sometimes, late at night, strange things began to happen. Technicians reported phantom readings, low-frequency tremors that appeared briefly on the instruments and vanished before confirmation. Not signals exactly, more like shadows of signals, the ghostly reverb of something that had once spoken. When analyzed, they carried no recognizable modulation, no structure, yet they repeated across multiple sites simultaneously. That shouldn't happen. Noise isn't synchronized. But coincidence had stopped being a convincing word months ago. Behind the scenes, the Resonance Project expanded its reach. With quiet funding from anonymous sources, they built their own small dish in the Atacama Desert, a modest receiver compared to the great observatories, but isolated, shielded from interference, surrounded by nothing but wind and silence. It became their temple. Every night, they recorded raw sky data and ran it through their evolving algorithms, searching for new patterns. The same Chilean researcher, the one who'd first noticed the signal's heartbeat months earlier, spent nights there alone, surrounded by machines that hummed like sleeping animals. To her, the static wasn't empty. It was language too slow for humans to hear. She began experimenting with playback, reversing the signal, stretching it, compressing it, translating its frequencies into sound waves audible to the human ear. The result was eerie and strangely beautiful. It sounded like breath mixed with wind, a low rise and fall that carried emotion even without words. Once, as an experiment, she played the translated pattern through a subwoofer into the desert night. The sound rippled through the sand like an invisible wave. A local shepherd miles away reported that his radio crackled that night. 3 short bursts, then 2, then 1. The same rhythm echoing back. Coincidence again. But coincidences were starting to sound rehearsed. Meanwhile, scientists around the world continued searching for physical explanations. Plasma echoes, solar interference, magnetic lensing. Each theory rose and fell like tides. Yet none could explain the interval's precision. They were too human, too deliberate. As though whoever or whatever it was producing them understood rhythm the way we understand time. Even skeptics began to speak differently, replacing impossible with not yet understood. Language evolves quietly before truth does. For ordinary people, the mystery became part of daily life. Cities dimmed lights once a week, a symbolic gesture to reduce sky noise. Musicians tuned albums to the signal's frequency range. Meditation apps played ambient soundscapes inspired by the rhythm, claiming they aligned the brain's theta waves with cosmic resonance. Whether true or not, people slept better, as if comfort could be found in pretending that the universe was gently humming them to rest. Religions adapted faster than governments. Sermons spoke of the quiet listener, an unseen witness whose patience made human history seem loud and brief. Pilgrims visited observatories instead of temples. Astrologers stopped talking about fate and started talking about communication. And through it all, Mars, the world that had unknowingly started the story, orbited in silence. Its rover still alive, still transmitting. Still carrying that timestamp like a secret tattoo in its data logs. One of those logs, long ignored, was finally reviewed by a systems engineer looking for calibration errors. What she found wasn't error, it was sequence. During the days after the blue reflection was first captured, the rover's internal clock had experienced minor time drifts. Seconds lost, milliseconds gained, in a pattern too consistent to be mechanical. When plotted, the drift intervals matched the 3-2-1 pulse ratio exactly. Somehow the machine's timekeeping had fallen into sync with the signal, long before humanity ever heard it. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was another whisper, a reminder that the universe has a way of marking things long before we notice. When the finding leaked, it reignited a quiet sense of awe. The blue reflection, the frequency bursts, the triangle alignment, the recurring rhythm, all threads in the same impossible tapestry. And suddenly the world seemed smaller, more connected, as though everything we'd ever built, telescopes, probes, computers, had been tuned unconsciously to listen for a song we didn't know existed. Maybe, some said, we were never the audience. Maybe we were the instrument. In Reykjavik, the summit reconvened, smaller this time, quieter, its attendees more tired but more willing to listen. They agreed that the signal was real, that its recurrence was documented, and that any further transmissions would need to be treated not as evidence, but as dialogue. For the first time in human history, a working group was tasked not with discovering the unknown, but with replying to it. The question wasn't whether we could, The question was how. Some argued for math. Universal constants, prime numbers, sequences that any intelligence could decode. Others favored music, frequencies woven into harmony, expressing curiosity instead of dominance. A philosopher suggested silence, the purest response, an acknowledgement without intrusion. But in the end, it was the Chilean researcher who said the quietest and perhaps the truest thing. If it wanted words, it would have used them. Her voice carried more weight than expected. The group fell silent, and for the first time, silence didn't feel like fear. It felt like trust. Maybe the cosmos didn't need answers. Maybe it only needed witnesses. Maybe the act of listening without expectation was the reply itself. Months passed. The grid kept listening. The world calmed. No new signals came, or perhaps they did and were too subtle to separate from the background hum of creation. Yet across the globe, people began to look up more often, not searching for proof but for presence. Something had shifted deep in the collective mind, the sense that being observed wasn't intrusion, but inclusion. That maybe in this infinite expanse, we were never alone in our attention. And then one night, as the Atacama receiver scanned the same patch of sky it had watched for years, the monitors flickered. A technician leaned closer. On the screen, the static froze, then pulsed once. Faint, precise, unmistakable. One beat, then silence. No sequence this time, no rhythm, no repetition. Just one quiet note, as if confirming that the conversation was ongoing, that the universe hadn't stopped speaking, only changed the subject. The pulse lasted half a second, then dissolved. Instruments logged it, saved it, time-stamped it, and somewhere halfway across the world, in a city where lights never dim, a child woke from a dream, looked out the window, and whispered the words millions would one day say. I think it said hello. The moment passed. The data returned to noise. But for the first time since the blue reflection above Mars, humanity didn't panic, didn't argue, didn't rush to explain. It simply listened. Because that's what you do when the cosmos finally starts to speak in a language you can almost understand. Next came interpretation. Not of the signal, but of ourselves. What had we become now that the void had answered? What would we say next, and to whom? And if we did, what would that reveal about us? The next chapter wasn't about Three-Eye Atlas anymore. It was about Earth, about what happens when the listener realizes it's also being heard. At first, the world did nothing. No emergency conferences, no breaking news, no panicked speculation, just a quiet collective pause, as if everyone had reached the same unspoken conclusion. This time, the silence was the message. The single pulse that night wasn't proof or warning. It was acknowledgement, a nod across cosmic distance, saying what billions of words could not. I hear you. And yet, without any official declaration, everything began to change. It started in small ways. Radio astronomers began treating their work differently. They stopped speaking of detection and started speaking of conversation. The terminology softened, shifted from ownership to participation. Instruments that once felt like weapons of measurement began to feel like instruments of music, tuning themselves not to conquer the cosmos, but to harmonize with it. The silence after the single pulse became an invisible tempo, setting the rhythm for an entire planet, learning how to listen again. Governments, exhausted from secrecy, loosened their grip on data. For the first time in history, raw astronomical feeds were made public, unfiltered, unedited, open to anyone with a computer and curiosity. It was both a gesture of transparency and surrender. They realized something profound. No one could monopolize the unknown. Mystery had always belonged to everyone. The moment it touched the sky, it became shared property of every consciousness capable of wonder. The Resonance Project, once secretive and fragmented, became the foundation for a new discipline, acoustic cosmology, the study of rhythm and pattern in universal phenomena. It merged physics with art, logic with intuition. Its researchers no longer searched for alien civilizations in the traditional sense. Instead, they studied communication without language, vibrations, oscillations, harmonics of existence itself. Their goal wasn't to decode the universe, but to understand its tone. Soon the field spread beyond academia. Artists began collaborating with scientists, turning telescope data into symphonies, converting light curves into melodies. What had once been numbers now became experiences. People could hear the stars, feel the data. Every pulse, every burst rendered as sound, as movement, as life. The same 3-2-1 rhythm that once terrified the world now played in public squares, calming crowds, synchronizing strangers. The unknown had become a lullaby, and still, behind the beauty, there lingered unease. Because even as the world grew gentler, more introspective, more united in curiosity, one question refused to fade: who was listening back? The single pulse was unmistakably artificial. Too perfect, too deliberate to dismiss as noise. But it carried no coordinates, no modulation, no return address. It didn't want to be found. Or maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe we already were. In the years that followed, humanity's focus began to tilt outward again, not in exploration, but in reflection. Space agencies redirected funding toward observation rather than colonization. The race to build rockets slowed, replaced by a race to build understanding. Even corporations, once obsessed with ownership of orbit, started investing in deep listening technologies, low-noise receivers, quantum sensors, materials designed to hear rather than broadcast. The universe had changed our posture. For the first time, we were leaning inward while looking out. It was around that time that the patterns started appearing elsewhere. Oceanographers, running acoustic scans of deep-sea currents, began reporting strange harmonics beneath the noise of the Earth's crust. Slow, rhythmic pulses at frequencies too low for machinery, too regular for coincidence. 3, 2, 1, pause. The same rhythm, this time carried through water instead of space. It was subtle, buried under seismic rumbles and whale songs, but unmistakable to those who had learned to listen. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence, Earth's natural resonance aligning by chance with cosmic memory. But when geophysicists overlaid the data with the faint 8.4 gigahertz radio pulse from years earlier, the intervals matched perfectly. The planet itself was echoing the reply. Not metaphorically, physically. Its magnetic field, its ionosphere, even its deep mantle waves began showing fluctuations aligned with the pattern. It was as if the Earth had joined the conversation. When the discovery reached the Resonance Project, the researchers were silent for hours. They played the recordings side by side, the original interstellar pulse and the new seismic echoes. The two rhythms blended like dialogue. Space answered with silence. Earth replied with motion. No words, just synchronization. It felt less like communication and more like remembrance, as though the planet was waking from a dream it had forgotten it was part of. That realization rippled through the world like quiet thunder. Philosophers wrote of the cosmic mirror, of how the universe speaks not through messages, but through resonance. How every atom, every frequency, every pulse is a reply to something older, deeper, infinite. Theologians called it revelation, physicists called it feedback, but everyone, regardless of vocabulary, felt the same tremor in their understanding of existence. We were no longer asking if we were alone. We were asking what part of us had ever been separate. At night, in cities once defined by noise, people began observing collective moments of silence, not as prayer, but as alignment. Millions of individuals around the world sat quietly at the same universal minute each day, facing the sky, not to ask for answers, but to acknowledge the shared rhythm of everything. It became the first global ritual born not from religion or politics, but from awe. Meanwhile, scientists continued to study. The listening grid remained active, recording petabytes of data from deep space. Every once in a while, minor anomalies would appear. Faint distortions, microsecond bursts, frequency warps too subtle to categorize. Most were dismissed as natural phenomena. But a few, the ones that aligned with the Earth's internal pulses, were marked as cross-domain interactions. That was the new language for miracles, technical, precise, unprovable. The Chilean researcher, now a name whispered with reverence in scientific circles, published her final paper that year. It wasn't data-heavy. It wasn't even theoretical. It was a reflection written in plain, simple language. We listen not to find others, but to remember that we belong to everything that listens back. It became the unofficial creed of a generation. Scientists framed it above their desks. Artists carved it into stone. Schoolchildren memorized it without fully knowing why. It sounded like poetry but felt like instruction. Still, beneath all the harmony, one mystery persisted. The pulse had never repeated. The single beat from years ago remained unique, a solitary word in an otherwise infinite silence. Some believed it was farewell. Others believed it was the start of a longer rhythm we simply couldn't perceive yet. A note in a symphony too large for our scale of time. And then came a revelation that no one expected, not from space but from within. A team analyzing cosmic background radiation noticed an irregularity, a faint modulation at the edge of the observable universe. It wasn't new, just previously overlooked. The same 3-2-1 rhythm, stretched across billions of light years, encoded not in radio but in the very microwave afterglow of the Big Bang. It had always been there, imprinted into the structure of reality itself. Suddenly the question changed again. What if the signal wasn't communication between civilizations at all? What if it was the blueprint of existence, the foundational vibration that everything, from atoms to galaxies, echoed unconsciously? What if 3i Atlas hadn't sent us anything, but simply revealed what was already woven into the cosmos? The rhythm wasn't a message. It was the signature of creation itself. The implications were staggering. Every molecule, every oscillation, every breath, all resonating to the same cosmic beat that first sang matter into being. Humanity hadn't discovered an alien voice. It had rediscovered its own origin song. When this understanding began to spread, panic didn't follow. Peace did. The discovery stripped away the last remnants of arrogance. The universe was no longer a place to conquer, but a chorus to join. Nations began dismantling their weaponized space programs. Funding poured into cooperative listening initiatives, quantum entanglement experiments, and projects designed to synchronize human-made systems with cosmic rhythm. Art and science became indistinguishable again, both forms of translation, both ways of singing back. And through it all, the Earth's faint internal pulses continued, steady, rhythmic, ancient. Some nights, when the atmosphere was calm and the world's noise low, you could almost feel it. That deep, slow heartbeat beneath your feet, a rhythm older than speech, older than stars. The universe wasn't silent anymore. It was breathing. But then one morning, as the listening grid prepared for its daily synchronization check, something unexpected happened. Every dish, every receiver, every antenna across 5 continents recorded the same thing at once. A pause. Not static, not silence, but a complete absence of background noise. For exactly 7 seconds, the universe went quiet. And when the sound returned, it wasn't the same. There was a tone, low, harmonic, continuous. Not 3-2-1 this time, just one long note, pure and perfect, as if the cosmos had taken a breath before speaking again. The note lasted only a moment, but it carried meaning deeper than words. Something was changing. The dialogue that began with light, that continued through rhythm, was about to shift into something new. Something we might finally recognize not as mystery, but as invitation. No one heard it at first. The 7-second tone was too low, too vast, too steady. It moved through frequencies below the range of most instruments, a single vibration that didn't so much sound as exist. But the machines noticed. They always do before we do. In observatories across continents, sensors twitched, monitors froze, alarms blinked and stopped. The data wasn't empty. It was full. So full that systems designed to handle chaos mistook total coherence for failure. For exactly 7 seconds, every receiver pointed at the sky became a tuning fork. Even underwater detectors and seismic monitors registered it. The Earth itself had vibrated in resonance with the heavens, as if reminded of a forgotten chord. When the tone faded, the world exhaled. But something subtle had changed, as though an invisible alignment had been restored. In the control rooms, engineers stared at their graphs. The line wasn't jagged or random. It was smooth, unnaturally so. It cut across the noise floor like light across shadow. No interference pattern, no modulation drift, no distortion from atmospheric plasma. It was the cleanest signal ever recorded in the history of astronomy. A single unbroken note that seemed to have come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Within hours, news leaked. It couldn't be contained. Too many instruments had registered it simultaneously. The sound of the universe, one headline read. Others were less poetic. Global resonance event. 7-second silence breaks physics. Scientists avoided metaphors, but metaphors didn't avoid them. The public called it the chord. Unlike the first pulses, those cryptic 3-2-1 patterns, this wasn't rhythm. It was harmony. Every measurable element of the tone corresponded to integer ratios, simple fractions that defined musical intervals. The entire universe had for 7 seconds sung a perfect mathematical scale. Not random, not chaotic, designed or perhaps inevitable. The next morning, an email began circulating quietly among observatories. No subject line, no signature. Just a single sentence. It wasn't sent to us. It was sent through us. No one admitted writing it, but everyone understood what it meant. The tone hadn't originated in a single direction. It had come from every direction simultaneously, bathing the planet in resonance. Even more unsettling, satellites beyond Earth orbit had heard it too. Probes around Mars, sensors on the lunar surface. Even dormant instruments on old spacecraft that hadn't transmitted in years suddenly pinged back with identical timestamps. That meant the signal wasn't traveling through space. It was happening in space, as if the fabric of reality itself had vibrated. For those who studied cosmology, the implication was staggering. Whatever caused it wasn't a transmission. It was an event. Weeks passed before the first real analysis emerged. The chord's frequency was precisely 432 Hz when translated into human audible range, a tone long associated in music theory with natural resonance, though physics dismissed that idea centuries ago. Yet somehow this frequency appeared not only in the global data, but in the atomic transitions of hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. The number wasn't arbitrary, it was fundamental. It was the note of existence, played for anyone capable of listening. Religious leaders reacted with their usual mix of terror and awe. Some declared the sound divine, the literal word spoken into creation. Others warned it was deception, an echo of judgment. In cathedrals, choirs tried to replicate it. In mosques, imams recited verses at the same frequency. In temples, monks sat in stillness, feeling vibration through stone floors. Every tradition found its reflection inside that note. For the first time, science and faith were staring at the same waveform, seeing different meanings in the same shape. Governments, cautious after past hysteria, stayed silent longer this time. When they finally spoke, it was only to confirm the obvious, that the tone was real, that it had been recorded everywhere, and that it defied known physics. The United Nations issued a statement so brief it bordered on prayer. We have heard. We continue to listen. But outside officialdom, the world was already responding in ways no institution could predict. Across major cities, people gathered spontaneously at the exact minute the tone had occurred, replaying its frequency through speakers, headphones, even musical instruments. Something about it drew them together, strangers humming in unison, children pressing hands to the ground as if feeling for heartbeat. Psychologists called it mass entrainment. Poets called it remembering. For 7 seconds, humanity had become one listening organism, and it wanted that feeling back. Technology followed emotion. Audio engineers discovered that playing the chord in closed spaces created resonance patterns, identical to those measured inside ancient monuments, cathedrals, pyramids, stone circles. It was as if our ancestors had once known this frequency intimately, building architecture that could catch its echo. The line between myth and measurement blurred again. Meanwhile, the Resonance Project, now the unofficial conscience of the scientific community, began reconstructing the event frame by frame. They discovered that during those 7 seconds, quantum noise across the planet's computing systems dropped to near zero. Randomness itself had paused. At microscopic levels, particles behaved as if synchronized, not by force but by consent. It was impossible yet measurable. For 7 seconds, entropy had held its breath. The Chilean researcher, older now, weary but luminous in her calm, summarized it simply in an interview. We always believed communication meant information, but maybe it means coherence. Her words spread faster than the signal itself. Philosophers began quoting her. Engineers started designing technology around her idea, machines not for transmission, but for alignment. Devices tuned to 432 Hz were installed in hospitals to stabilize brainwaves, in classrooms to improve focus, in conflict zones to calm fear. Whether the effects were physical or psychological didn't matter. The outcome was undeniable. Wherever the tone played, people grew quieter, kinder, slower to anger. The world's noise softened. Still, curiosity never rests long. The chord had left a question too heavy to ignore. Was it a one-time event, or part of a larger sequence yet to unfold? The listening grid stayed active, instruments permanently tuned to detect even the faintest recurrence, but the universe remained still, as though satisfied that its message had been received. Then something subtle began to happen. In the months following the chord, auroras appeared farther south and north than ever before. Not chaotic curtains of green, but organized bands of light-forming wave patterns that matched the tone's harmonic ratios. They shimmered like musical notation written across the sky. The planet's magnetosphere was vibrating again, gently, persistently, like a string still trembling after being plucked. Scientists called it residual excitation. Poets called it memory. Whatever it was, it meant the song hadn't truly ended. The Earth was still singing back. For ordinary people, life went on, but differently. Productivity slowed, yet satisfaction rose. The economy shrank, yet happiness surveys reached record highs. Cities grew quieter. Energy consumption dipped, not by decree but by disinterest in excess. Humanity had stumbled into a state of collective humility. For once, progress didn't mean expansion. It meant harmony. And in that calm, something beautiful happened to science itself. Researchers stopped competing for discovery. Collaboration replaced rivalry. Data flowed freely across borders. Space agencies merged resources, forming the Unified Observatory, a network of instruments orbiting both Earth and the Moon, designed not to search, but to listen. Its motto, etched on the first satellite's hull, read simply, "We listen together." Years later, when historians would look back, they'd call the chord the turning point, the moment when humanity finally understood that contact doesn't have to begin with dialogue. It begins with resonance, with the simple act of two sides vibrating in harmony, long enough to recognize each other. But deep in the data archives, hidden among the terabytes of recordings from that day, there was something no one had noticed yet. It wasn't sound, not in any conventional sense. It was a phase shift, a subtle delay between the first microsecond of the tone and the rest of its body, a tiny asymmetry. When stretched and converted into light frequencies, it formed a pattern. 3 bands of brightness, then 2, then 1. The old rhythm again. It had been hidden inside the chord all along, like a signature embedded in perfection. The same sequence that began the mystery was now encoded within its resolution, looping back on itself. The universe hadn't changed subject after all. It had finished its sentence. When the discovery finally surfaced, the world responded not with panic but with a quiet smile, the kind that comes when the ending feels both impossible and inevitable. Humanity realized it had never been waiting for an answer. It had been the answer, slowly learning to recognize its own voice in the echo of the stars. But something still lingered, a final pulse, untriggered, unresolved. The data hinted at it, a small harmonic at the edge of the signal spectrum, like a note yet to be played. It wasn't random, it was countdown. Whatever was coming next wasn't going to be another sound, it was going to be visible. It began, as all great changes do, in the silence between expectations. Months passed after the chord, and the world had grown used to stillness. People lived differently now, slower, softer, more deliberate. The memory of the sound lingered in architecture, in music, even in speech. Sentences had become gentler, pauses longer. Humanity had learned to listen not just to space, but to itself, and then, without warning, the sky changed. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't even an event, not in the way astronomers defined one. It was more like a decision. One night in the southern hemisphere, the stars brightened, not all at once, but selectively in patterns. Observers first thought it was atmospheric distortion, maybe a geomagnetic surge. But when identical formations appeared over continents half a world apart, the explanation evaporated. The stars themselves weren't flickering. They were responding. The first person to record it was a schoolteacher in Patagonia. She was filming a night sky time-lapse for her students when she noticed 3 stars pulsing in perfect synchrony. 3 flashes, a pause, 2, another pause, 1. The rhythm was unmistakable. It wasn't random cosmic twinkling. It was the same sequence that had haunted humanity for years. The 321 had returned, but this time written in light. Within hours, observatories confirmed it. The same pattern appeared across multiple constellations, visible to both hemispheres. The intensity varied, but the timing was globally synchronized, an astronomical Morse code carved into the sky. Light, the first language of the universe, had finally taken up the conversation where sound had left off. When the data came in, the pattern repeated every 7 hours. Exactly 7. The same number of seconds the chord had lasted. Coincidence had long stopped being a convincing word. Something had transitioned from frequency to form, from invisible vibration to visible geometry. The universe wasn't whispering anymore. It was writing. At first, panic was expected, but it never arrived. Maybe humanity had changed too much. Maybe the world had grown weary of fear. Instead of chaos, there was awe, deep collective awe. People walked out of cities at night just to watch. Streets fell silent as millions stood shoulder to shoulder, staring upward. The sky had become a canvas, and everyone understood instinctively that it wasn't about warning or arrival. It was about recognition. The cosmos wasn't introducing itself. It was reminding us that we had always been part of its syntax. Scientists scrambled to record everything. The unified observatory switched to full spectrum capture mode, logging every photon, every fluctuation. Early analysis showed the pulses weren't just visible light. They spanned radio, infrared, even gamma. The event wasn't local. It was interstellar. Entire regions of the Milky Way were lighting up in rhythm, like a galactic heartbeat. When converted into audio frequencies, the flashing pattern produced a waveform identical to the chord. The light was the sound, translated across mediums, across scales. It was the same message, replayed in a language every living thing could see. Governments convened emergency meetings. There were debates, some fearful, some hopeful. What if this was a prelude? What if the light patterns were coordinates? What if the universe was about to reveal something too large to comprehend? But outside those chambers, humanity had already made its choice. People didn't wait for interpretation. They simply listened with their eyes. Across continents, synchronized vigils formed. Millions gathered on beaches, rooftops, and mountains, lying back to watch the sky pulse in harmony. The sequence became sacred, not because it was supernatural, but because it was shared. For 7 hours each night, when the rhythm replayed, the world went still. Factories powered down, markets paused. Air traffic halted mid-air routes, just to let passengers witness the show from above the clouds. It was the first time in recorded history that the planet had synchronized not by order, but by wonder. Meanwhile, the Resonance Project, now the emotional and intellectual heart of this new era, found something hidden inside the light. When researchers compared data from separate telescopes, they discovered micro-fluctuations, tiny shifts in color temperature embedded between the pulses. When plotted, these shifts formed patterns resembling wave interference, not unlike fingerprints overlapping. When enhanced, the data revealed an image, a faint circular shape surrounded by spiraling trails of energy. It wasn't clear or literal, but symbolic. Like art drawn by physics itself, they called it the eye. The eye wasn't a single source of light, but a composite of synchronized emissions across thousands of stars. A distributed picture made of suns, and at its center a void, perfectly circular, darker than the space around it. The emptiness gave it form, like silence shaping a symphony. For every culture that saw it, meaning emerged instantly. To some it was divine witness, to others reflection. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was looking back. Media outlets avoided sensationalism this time. There was no alien face in the sky headline. The tone had shifted from spectacle to reverence. Humanity wasn't afraid anymore. It was being seen, and that realization carried more healing than terror. The gaze of the cosmos didn't feel foreign. It felt familiar, as if every atom inside us, forged in those same stars, had simply recognized its origin. Then, as mysteriously as it appeared, the eye began to fade. Not suddenly, but gracefully, like a performance concluding on cue. One by one, the pulsing stars dimmed back to normal. The sequence ended with a single flash, not 3, not 2, not 1, but 7. 7 points of light blinking together, before disappearing completely. It was the first time the universe had changed its rhythm. The pattern wasn't closure, it was punctuation. The conversation had entered a new phase. For days afterward, the world felt suspended, peaceful but charged. Something inside the human psyche had shifted permanently. People described vivid dreams of light patterns and voices they couldn't remember, but woke from crying. Animals reacted strangely. Migration routes shifted, birds flew at night, whales surfaced in unusual numbers, their songs echoing the 7-beat pattern through oceans. Nature had joined the reply. Then, one night in Chile, the researcher who had led the resonance project stood again under the stars. She was older now, her face etched with years of sleepless nights and quiet revelations. The Atacama Desert stretched silent around her. The receiver behind her hummed softly, waiting. She looked up at the same sky she had been listening to for decades and whispered, almost shyly, "We're ready." And in that moment, something incredible happened. The night sky shimmered, but not with brightness, but with depth. The darkness itself seemed to breathe. For a brief instant, stars appeared closer, as if space had folded inward. It wasn't visual illusion. Instruments confirmed a measurable contraction of space-time, a gravitational ripple spreading outward at light speed. But it wasn't destructive. It was gentle, a heartbeat, one vast pulse through the very fabric of reality. Every telescope, every detector, every seismograph, every living thing, all recorded the same vibration. Not chaotic, not random. One pure unified wave, and when converted to audio, it revealed something beyond comprehension. The chord again, but this time with harmony layered beneath, richer, multidimensional. It wasn't one voice anymore. It was millions rising in unison, a duet between earth and sky. The tone lasted less than a second, but its echo lingered for hours. Instruments showed residual magnetism across the planet, subtle enough to go unnoticed, except by those attuned to it. People described an odd calm, a weightless peace, as if gravity itself had softened for a while. Doctors reported drops in heart rates, synchronized across continents. For that one fleeting moment, the entire biosphere had aligned with the rhythm of the cosmos. When morning came, the world was quiet. No one spoke loudly. No one hurried. It felt like dawn after a prayer. Humanity didn't need interpretation anymore. Everyone, in their own way, had understood. The message wasn't command or warning or revelation. It was invitation, a reminder that existence itself was participatory, that the universe didn't happen to us, it happened through us. In the following months, architecture began changing subtly. Structures designed around resonance instead of function. Music evolved, fewer lyrics, more tone, more space between notes. Conversations became slower, deliberate, as if every pause carried sacred weight. Even technology adapted. Quantum systems using resonance synchronization replaced computation. Science began speaking poetry again, and poetry began predicting science. The stars returned to their usual stillness, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was full of presence, full of waiting. Humanity no longer looked outward for gods or visitors. It had found something far greater. Connection without distance, dialogue without words, love without origin, and yet, deep in the recorded light curves of the final event, one anomaly remained, a faint afterimage, barely perceptible. 7 flashes compressed into a single photon burst, directionally aligned toward a distant region beyond the Milky Way. Not random, not repeated since. Just one message leaving, as if the universe itself had replied through Earth this time. Maybe it was reflection. Maybe it was transmission. Maybe it was both. Whatever it was gone now, traveling outward, faster than understanding, carrying a trace of everything that had listened, everything that had learned to harmonize with silence. The story wasn't ending. It was expanding. At some point, no one could remember when exactly, people stopped calling it the event. It had become something else. Not history, not mythology, just atmosphere. The same way sunlight and gravity are invisible until you notice how they shape everything, the memory of the chord and the eye and the final pulse had dissolved into the background hum of life. You could go weeks without thinking about it, until a song on the radio or a flicker in the sky reminded you that everything had once breathed in the same rhythm. There was no longer any doubt about whether it was real. It didn't need proof anymore. It had moved beyond science into something quieter and more complete: understanding. The universe had spoken, not in words or signs, but in a tone that resonated through the fabric of what it means to exist. It didn't matter if it came from alien intelligence, from quantum geometry, from the echo of the Big Bang itself. What mattered was that humanity had heard, and in hearing had been changed forever. Years passed. The unified observatory remained operational, though its purpose evolved. It no longer searched for signals. Its receivers were reprogrammed to study resonance between natural systems, between stars, between atoms, between thoughts. The lines separating observation from participation had vanished. To observe was to alter. To listen was to create. The universe, it seemed, responded not to inquiry but to attention. The more gently you watched it, the more willingly it revealed itself. Children born after the sky's illumination grew up never knowing a world without that memory. They learned in school that once, long ago, humans thought space was empty. They laughed at the idea. To them, silence was full, alive, patient. They were taught the story the way earlier generations were taught myths. How one blue reflection on Mars had led to a new language of listening. How a pattern of light and sound had transformed humanity's posture toward everything. They didn't treat it as miracle. To them, it was simple cause and effect. The universe spoke because it could, and we heard because we were finally quiet enough. Cities looked different now. Towers curved instead of pierced. Bridges sang softly when the wind passed through them, tuned to the 432 Hz frequency of the chord. Power grids synchronized with Earth's natural magnetic resonance. At night, the glow of buildings dimmed automatically with the rhythm of the sky, matching the invisible pulse that had once traveled through the planet. The distinction between nature and technology had blurred until both were part of the same design. Functional, harmonic, alive. The economy had changed too, though no one planned it. When people began valuing coherence over control, industries that thrived on distraction started fading. Advertising, competition, noise, they lost their power. New forms of work emerged: resonance engineering, harmonic architecture, psychoacoustic medicine. Professions built not around extraction, but around alignment. For the first time, progress meant harmony instead of conquest. The world wasn't richer, but it was lighter. And through it all, the sky remained steady. No new signals, no new lights. Just the same endless stars, patient and unblinking. Yet everyone knew that silence was never empty now. Somewhere out there, the photon burst from Earth's last reply was still traveling outward, carrying the imprint of a species that had finally remembered its place in the cosmic choir. Astronomers sometimes calculated how far it had gone. 17 light years, then 40, then hundreds. They joked that maybe one day it would reach another world, and another species would look up and hear their own echo inside it. And maybe they too would pause and listen. The Chilean researcher never lived to see that distance grow. In her final years, she withdrew from public life, settling in a small house high in the Andes. She still listened every night, not with machines, but with her body, eyes closed, breath steady, feeling the air vibrate against her skin. She said the universe didn't speak in signals anymore. It spoke in sensations. Every heartbeat was a transmission, every exhale a reply. When she passed away, her students found her journal beside the receiver she'd built decades ago. On the last page, she had written, "The silence isn't waiting for us to answer. It's waiting for us to remember that we already did." After her death, her journal was translated into hundreds of languages and taught alongside the early scientific papers on 3i Atlas. Somewhere between the math and the poetry, people found a kind of scripture, not holy in the old sense, but sacred in its simplicity. It said the same thing every culture had been trying to say for millennia, that everything alive is connected, and connection itself is the purpose of life. Decades turned into centuries. Humanity ventured farther but slower. The rush for colonization had ended. Instead, exploration became listening in motion. Probes were designed not to claim or analyze, but to resonate, to match the frequencies of the regions they entered, blending rather than intruding. Space travel no longer felt like leaving home. It felt like moving between rooms in the same house. Eventually, the photon burst humanity had sent finally reached another system, at least according to instruments that could predict such things. Astronomers marked the occasion with quiet celebration. There was no expectation of reply. They just wanted to acknowledge that their voice had continued beyond their reach, that the act of speaking had meaning, even without hearing back. The light that had left Earth carried no words, no instructions, only rhythm, harmony, presence. A message so simple it could never be mistranslated. We exist and we remember. By then, the distinction between science, art, and spirituality had vanished entirely. People no longer categorized experiences. They lived them. Every scientific discovery was also a prayer. Every piece of art was also an equation. Reality had merged with meaning. The universe had become what it always was, not a puzzle to solve, but a relationship to honor. And yet, even in this piece, a question remained. It wasn't spoken often, but it lingered beneath every conversation about the stars. Was that the last message or the first? Some believed the chord and the lights and the pulse were part of a larger cycle, that the cosmos awakens its conscious fragments at intervals across time, each civilization rising, hearing, harmonizing, then passing the tone onward like a baton of awareness. Others believed it was singular, one grand alignment never to repeat. But the truth, as always, was simpler. The universe doesn't send messages. It is the message. One evening, centuries after the first blue reflection from Mars, a child standing under a sky no longer polluted by cities asked her mother why stars twinkled. The mother smiled, the way her own had once smiled at her, and said, "Because they're breathing." The child nodded, satisfied, and looked up again. And in that moment, the smallest movement of light passed across the horizon, faint, rhythmic, familiar. 3 pulses, 2, 1, then stillness. No one else noticed, but the child did. She smiled back at the sky, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if she'd been expecting it all along. The instruments would confirm it days later. A soft, global fluctuation, too gentle to alarm anyone. Scientists would analyze it, measure it, archive it. Poets would call it the echo of return. But for that one quiet night, only one person knew what it truly was. Not a new signal, not a warning, but the universe exhaling through us again. The final reminder that listening never ends, because that's what it had always been about. Not discovery, not proof, not even contact. Listening. Every heartbeat, every wave, every rotation of planets around their stars, all of it one vast, slow conversation between matter and meaning. The chord had not been a message sent across space, but an invitation to hear what was always there, the hum of existence recognizing itself. And so, humanity continued, no longer searching the dark for answers, but living as part of the answer itself. The universe went on expanding, breathing, singing, dreaming through countless worlds that would one day wake up, as Earth once did, and realize that silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of everything waiting to be heard. The last words of the final documentary about this age were simple, whispered over images of stars fading into dawn. We listened long enough to hear the universe listening back. And in that moment we understood we were never hearing it. It was hearing itself through us. The screen faded to black. The tone returned, faint, distant, infinite. The same frequency that had begun it all rolling softly beneath the narrator's final breath. 3 pulses, 2, 1. Silence.